Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to Prime Time Sunday. Our topic tonight is the Liberia's economic development, challenges, and imperatives for post-COVID growth and stability. My guest is Dr. Samuel Y. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you to you and Focus team for inviting me and having me this evening.
We are honored to have you. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation.
I am honored, not you.
So two people can be honored at the same time.
Okay.
All right. So we are happy to have you to discuss the Liberia's economic development, challenges, and imperatives for post-COVID growth and stability. By the way, Dr. Johnson is a professor or instructional professor at Delaware State University. He is I always like politics, development economist. And we are here
political economy as well. In development economics, we talk about political economy.
Okay, so you are two in one. So thank you so much. Let's start and welcome you again. This is your first time on Focus on Liberia. Thank you again for coming, and we thank all those who made it possible for you to be here. A little bit about yourself that I did not cover. Any fun fact, anything you want my audience to know?
Well, I'm Samuel Jones, as you said. I call myself a student of economic development. Before I came to the States, I've worked in development with the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, taught at the University of Liberia. Another secret you might not know, Dennis, is that I'm a former broadcaster.
Okay.
I work for Star Radio. I work for Radio Veritas, and a host of newspapers in Liberia up to 2004. I left active media practice to go pursue my passion now in economic development. So
thank you so much.
I hope I cover all of the bases.
If there's any
other things specifically you need to know.
Excellent. You did. You cover all the bases. So we're happy to have you. Let's go straight into it. We describe you as a development economist. So I want to start from there. Growing up, I knew only three professions: pastor, doctor, and what?
Teacher.
Yeah, that's all I knew. So this is new. Tell me, what is development economics?
So it means those were the three different sets of people that impacted your lives at that age.
Definitely. And those are the people that I really came in contact with.
That's good. Well, development economics is a branch of economics. I'm sure you know what economics is. Economists are concerned about how ordinary people make choices that affect that help them decide how to satisfy their competing wants and priorities. So just by that discussion, just by that description, you get to realize that there are two things that are moving hand in hand, two overarching themes. One, competing priorities and needs, choices. And choices imply that there is something that is not adequate to meet all of the needs and choices that ordinary person may have. And so that becomes a question of scarcity. In the context of economic development, then the question is not only about private resources that you have as an individual, your income, your house, but it's also about the wealth of the country, the natural resources that we have. And the fundamental question there then is, how do we use those natural resources, those wealth, to improve the well-being of ordinary citizens? And here, when we talk about well-being, we are actually talking about being well. So it means then you have access to education, not just mere access, but access to quality and employable education, access to healthcare. And you also are able to have sustenance in your own way using the means of production that is devised by the economy. And in so doing, then the goal there, one, is to ensure sustenance, that people are consuming and they are consuming food that impacts their health. It's not just about consuming food because you are hungry, but those food that have meaning for your health outcomes, food that are healthy, that are able to prevent diseases, food that are curable in their own chemical construct. And then you also have to think about the empowerment aspect now, self-esteem, where there is respect for the human dignity. So it goes down beyond just the question of consumption, which is measured based on per capita income, because income is the most important driver of consumption here, but it also now has to do with the laws. How do you value human dignity? Are you putting people at the center of what you're doing? So it has to do with the rights of women, gender empowerment, for example. And then the third part has to do now with economic choices, that people have the freedom, they are empowered to make the decisions that they feel is important for the life that is so desired. So it's not about the state determining what people want to be, but it's about the state creating a condition using the available wealth of the society that people will be able to make their own independent choices to influence decisions both at their own household level and then at the national level.
It sounds a little aspirational for me. Is this obtainable?
Yes, it is obtainable. Just look around you. Where do you live? The United States, right?
Yeah, Georgia.
We may not be there in terms of 100%, and that is why you see this tension in the politics. Is really a tension of political economy, it's a tension of power, because you cannot talk about economic development looking at only the economic dimension. All right. And because those who control political power are the ones that have the means to determine how wealth is distributed.
Yeah.
So you have to think about the political economy piece, and you can see what is happening around here. One public instrument I always like to direct people's attention to is the budget, for instance.
Yeah.
The budget determines our rights and privileges, the amount of access we have to natural resources, through expenditure, for example, through taxation. And so societies, if you look like the Scandinavian countries, Sweden and other places, they've been able to reach there. So it is aspirational, but it's something achievable. And I don't think if this was not something that was achievable, people who came before my generation, in my own generation, would have invested so much time into probing this particular question.
Yeah. And, looking at the name, political economics, development economics, just by not reading anything, the first thought I had was, okay, this could be for developing countries. Maybe it's a way the Western nations or improved or developed nations are trying to solve the problems of developing nations with this whole concept of development economics. I hope that is not true, but what role?
If you look at the current focus, since especially the 1950s, or maybe after World War II, 1950s, when this whole discipline took off, now it began focusing on those countries that we call developing countries like Liberia. But before that, if you go back to the work of Adam Smith, that was in the 1700s, his work was really a piece of work on economic development, the issue of even followed by people like David Ricardo. And what they were trying to emphasize was, how do you use the wealth of a nation to develop the people? And the reason for that is that you always hear people say a healthy people is a healthy nation.
Right.
So if you cannot improve the qualitative well-being of the people, obviously, the nation itself will not be qualitatively improved. It would be a center for peace and stability. And so it's not, yes, the present focus is on countries that are called developing countries because they are the ones who are faced with these challenges. But it's not something that begins with a focus on third world countries, so to speak. I hate to use the term third world, but it's not something that began with a focus on developing countries. It was something that began with the countries in the richer bracket of the globe.
And at that time, I think the focus also was inward, right? Nationalism, and how to use the wealth of other nations to develop themselves.
Yeah, you're talking now about the mercantilist revolution, where they go fight the war, capture the state, and capture that wealth and bring it back home. Adam Smith was reacting to that. All right. So, and that's the whole evolution. That's how it has gone. So you think about it in a way, then you could kind of see a connection between development economics as a branch of economics, as a cousin, I would like to say, or a sister to another branch of economics called international economics, which focuses now on how do you manage global economic interaction to develop the people of the globe.
And so talking about the development economics of today, what role does or do bodies like the World Bank, IMF have to play? Because sometimes we look at that, especially from the African perspective, that really do these people have our best interest?
Do they have our best interest?
Yeah, they are the one advising us on how they think we can do better economically.
Well, why was the World Bank, the IMF, and other international organizations established after the World Wars? The Bretton Woods Conference, all right? It was established to ensure that you have a stable global economic interaction among countries. And so ever since you had the World Bank coming up, you have that addresses the needs of the common people. If you look at the way the two of them operate, and then you have the International Monetary Fund that works mostly dealing with the macro level questions, the issue of price stability, the issue of GDP growth, for example. And so over time, they've been informing, what they've been doing is providing a sort of mirror to developing countries and say, look, this is what you look like from our standpoint. And we think that given what we're seeing, you should move in this direction. Has the outcome been entirely good for developing countries? Not in all cases. All right. But if you look at what is happening, for instance, in developing countries, we have, like in the case of Liberia, I was looking at the government's own national development plan. And one thing they capture so eloquently there is that the country is at its current state of development largely because of low human resource capital, and two, because of poor state of infrastructure, which is a challenge with many developing countries. And the question now is, how do you address it? One, and why does it have to be? So you have one, capital constraint in terms of infrastructure, financial constraint to support the construction of those infrastructure. I mean, I need not tell you, you are a man of the media, so I'm quite sure you've been following the news back home. Since this current administration came to power, its biggest development goal has been to connect the country from coast to coast. Right. That is an infrastructure constraint. And if anybody were to achieve it, I can tell you that the multiplier effect over a period of time is going to be bigger, because what you're going to have is that you're going to address a major challenge that is faced by people who do farming in up country, the question of farm to market routes. Now they are going to be able to access markets. So they're not going to be victims of the middleman who goes from one capital to the interior and give them a discounted rate for the sales of their produce. They will not be able to access markets directly. But another challenge, I mean, I'm not saying this to say that road is going to solve all of the problem with agricultural production in Liberia, because another challenge that the farmers also have is the question of storage. So you harvest today, you harvest tomorrow, you have to harvest over a period of time. And until you complete the harvest, in order to have a quantity of goods to be sold, you must be able to store and preserve those goods. And so storage is also a challenge. But in terms of road construction, in terms of the infrastructure constraint, we're going to be able to address that. And just look, for instance, in downtown Monrovia, until 1980 OAU, for example, see the volume of economic activity that has taken place along that corridor across the Gabriel Johnson Tucker Bridge, further now into Tuckerburg, where you see the cities expanding explosively in areas, Virginia and beyond. Those are only taking place because people now are able to access economic centers like Monrovia, where everybody goes to gain some form of employment, everybody goes to do some daily hustle. That is why you see that is happening. So infrastructure is a very good thing. And our own partnership with these organizations helps also to move us in another direction, because if you notice what happened after Madam Salif came to power, after we ended the violence of 14 years, the first challenge we had was, how do we access global finance? We had a cash-strapped economy. We needed resources to jumpstart our own lives. And so where did we turn? We had to turn to the international system. And we're only able to access those resources. We may argue whether we can argue the question of fairness. That's another chapter for this book. But we're able to use those resources, to access those resources, because of our own membership and our own engagement with these organizations.
Thank you. Am I losing you? Can you hear me?
I'm here, Dennis.
Okay. That's kind of, your video is kind of getting blurry. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are discussing Liberia's economic development, challenges, and imperatives for post-COVID growth and stability. So that leads us to economic development, which is our topic for today. Let's start with definition. What is economic development, and how is that different from other forms of development?
Economic development is, it's interrelated to other form of development. It has to do with, and development economics is a branch of economics that is focused on economic development. And the central question there has to do with the well-being. And so we're always concerned about the issue of income. We are always concerned about the issue of poverty, the issue of inequality. In the case of Liberia, we see that clearly. We see the significance of emphasizing that question clearly. If you just look back to 1989, what caused the Civil War? All of our development programs since the Civil War have captured that so accurately. And I like the way the poverty reduction strategy of Madam Salif, the first PRSP, said what? It was a result of the marginalization and exclusion of the majority population of the country. What was that marginalization? Was it economic entirely? No. It was politics as well. So it has to do now with the question of voice and participation. We all argue that there was growth. Yes, Liberia has experienced growth over those years. If you look at the Tubman years, you look at the Talbot years, there was significant growth that took place. And we saw the economy booming over time. We saw a rise in per capita income in terms of averaging. Right? But the fundamental question was that, okay, who all are really having this volume of money?
Yeah.
But then if you go back, I mean, I'm afraid I'm going to be a little bit an economic historian, but if you go back, you can argue, and that is, I'm one of the few persons who really rejects this growth and growth without development thesis. Because if you look at what was obtaining in Liberia at the time, all of the academic work spoke to development. And what was the definition of development at the time? Was growth in income, GDP growth, and how do we evaluate impact on people? Consumption. So what was happening in Liberia is that, and it was the problem now of structural transformation that we're trying to put in place. You attract the foreign direct investment, you had investment taking place across the country, in Nimba, in Bombing, in Habel. The iron ore mines were booming. The rubber plantation was booming. And so those centers where you had these investment taking place were really to function, to serve as centers of growth. But there is a challenge with that, a particular approach. Those centers of growth are assumed to be centers that will attract people. And so you have what they call the backwash effect. What is the backwash effect? It's going to move people away from other productive areas. And so the development now will be concentrated within those areas. They also challenged, the other expectation was that then there was going to spread. So you come in from Kepamos to Bombing, you have an income earning opportunity there. You are going to take that the gains from there back to your village and develop your village, which was to lead to the spread effect. But in the absence of that, the next question was, so how do you address the backwash effect where people are really moving in and people are not moving out? There was no linkage between the rest of the economy and in this center. That was the question of national development planning. And I think that was where we had some challenge. But notwithstanding at the time, you can realize one thing you get to know is that there were qualitative changes that were taking place. For instance, the money income, even for those whom in the Liberian literature would term the indigenous, the people in the rural parts, had gone up four times. There was an increase in the number of pliable roads across Liberia, right? The number of student enrollment was increasing.
Right.
But what was not happening is that the country was not reaching its full potential. So what the growth without development really tried to suggest that this country wasn't growing, it wasn't really that the country wasn't, or this country wasn't developing. It wasn't really that the country wasn't developing, but the country was behind its assumed potential. So Liberia wasn't reaching its potential.
Or what we saw in the GDP growth did not commensurate the development or
the qualitative aspect was missing. But here's the thing. Dennis, what was the indicator of development at the time? Growth.
Does that change from time to time? It doesn't.
It has really changed. If you look at since the 1990, when this whole thing of the PRSP started, which was a way again of the international system to say, look, based on the work of Stiglitz, that said, look, we cannot look at development as a path dependence question. At the time we're talking about in the 60s, everybody was saying development is modernization. People are able to buy new cars. You are able to move the population away from primary agriculture into the plant. I mean, I don't like to use the term plant, but you're moving them away from primary agriculture into tertiary agriculture,
right.
Tertiary production. And so in that way, you are increasing their income. The income will increase their welfare. So you are modernizing the society. You are moving the society away from agrarian to a more modern system. And then you have people like Rosto who are saying, look, every country has to go through these stages: pre-takeoff, preparation for takeoff, and then the stage of mass consumption. But one thing that wasn't being captured was that all of those models were based either on Latin America or, in the case of Rosto, in the West. And so we're superimposing the experiences of the West on developing countries without considering the context of those countries. We're not looking at the question of the politicking. We're not looking at the question of the structure of society. Like growth without development, what was their principal finding? That Liberia was backward because of its tradition and social structure. That's entirely a different question. And if you want to challenge that thesis, then look at what happened in the Turbo years. Turbo was able to provide free education up to high school level. He was able to, with his growth with development program, he was able to cut in half the cost of the cost of higher education. People who were going to college were paying 50%. Government was providing the other 50%. And you saw what happened. We started seeing high schools being constructed across the country.
Yeah.
But those social structures were still in place. It didn't change. The chiefs were still the rulers of the town. We still had a clan system. So now how can you argue that the traditional system that was in place in Liberia was an impediment to the country's development? Well, they made that argument because it came from this whole thinking that for the economy to be, for a society to be considered a developed society, it must be modern.
All right, and we can have you back to continue along those lines. But for now, let's go back to economic development in the context of Liberia. So, what will when Liberia is developed economically, what does it look like? Give me a picture.
If Liberia is developed, it means then we'll have we will have an improved quality of the population, which will be reflective in its workforce. How do I explain that to my grandma?
Right. And how is that measured?
Yeah. It means then three things, which I spoke of earlier: that people have an income that enable them to consume quality food. They are able to have access to education, quality education. They are able to have access to better healthcare. And that will be reflected in indicators like life expectancy, like knowledge, and like consumption, for example, sustenance of life. That will be a developed Liberia. That will be a Liberia that has gone one step further. And I'm going to sound like a broken record here. The interesting thing is, a good thing for the country. Successive since this civil war, we've all learned our lessons as a country. And so one thing that has been emphasized by this current regime and the past regime has been that direction. And it's important because if you look at Liberia PRSP compared to the PRSP of other countries that came from civil war, our PRSP has been one that really tried to look at our development question and its linkage to the violence that we had.
Right. And that link that PRS drew is something that I disagree with, but that's can be left for another discussion. That is
disagreement. There is no way you can defend it. The civil war of Liberia only took place because of inequality.
Yeah, and that's what I would say. I disagree because those who, the perpetrators of the war, were just greedy warmongers for power.
No,
So
no, Dennis.
it had nothing to do with inequality.
I'm going to push you back here now.
Yeah, sure.
Why is it? I mean, look at the reasons why people fought. One, income. There were others who fought because they wanted to be a part of history. But you cannot rule out the fact that people fought because they wanted improved living conditions. If you listen to all of the framing that was done to mobilize the country behind the violence, it had to do with inequality, either in terms of power, in terms of income, or in terms of social access. All right? So development, I mean, that is why I always like to use the term economic development, because that's the focus of development economics itself. You cannot talk about a country developing by focusing only on economics, only on the income structure. If you talk about the issue of dignity and the respect for rights, you are talking now about politicking here. So it has to do with the institutional structure. How inclusive is governance? Who are those making the decision in governance? And where is governance directing people's resources? If you look at countries like Korea, South Korea, for example, that have developed and advanced over the past years, those countries have only reached those stages because you have had governments that have invested in its people, providing quality education, providing better health care, encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation, investing in infrastructure. So in that way, you widen a space. So it's not because of where you are or which political party you belong to that is going to be used as a determinant for you to access those gains of the economy. Everybody has an equal chance. And now you cannot tell me that was the case in Liberia. If you look at the Tobos development plan, he came up and said, "What? I'm going to ensure that we have an elementary school in any village that has up to a certain number of children that needed access to education." All right. So what happened? Do we still have schools, elementary schools across every major population center of Liberia? No.
No, we don't.
Even where the schools are, how many persons? Now, parents in Liberia, we all decide between sending our children to government school and private schools. And that explains why you have the present number of enrollment in the leaving public schools in Liberia, because parents are not too happy about the quality
of the public.
So that's a form of inequality.
Okay.
That's a form of inequality. And not to bore you, but even if you look at the case of the first administration, in as much as it tried, the fundamental challenge that came out of the CRS, the Catholic Relief Service study, was that the question of wealth distribution was still
that was a
burning issue in Liberia. And people will argue, how much wealth did we have? But then we have to think about how the government assigned concession rights to areas that were awarded to international, well, to multinational corporations, for instance. Whose voice made that determination? It was determined at the macro level, not the micro level. And so you understand that is why you find a lot of tensions between these concession organizations and the locals on whose land these resources were being extracted.
So Dr. Johnson, what is the difference between economic development and economic growth? Can we use them interchangeably?
No, I wouldn't want to use that interchangeably.
Okay.
It's a very delicate balance here. Economic growth, just focus on the numbers. Is your income going up? GDP per capita, or GDP, the size of the economy, is it going up? Going up by what rate? Now we begin to talk about the economy is growing up at a rate of 2%. The economy is growing up at a rate of 12%. That is growth. When you begin to think about economic development now, you're not only focusing on growth. Growth is an essential part of that discussion. So you're talking now about the question of governance, institutions. What is the nature of the macroeconomic framework? How many persons are able to have access to justice? Okay. How many persons are able to have access to leadership? What is the voice? What is the level of input do ordinary citizens have in decisions that affect their own daily lives? So now you're going beyond the economics. Now you are talking about the politics. You are talking about the economics. You are talking about social as well. So you come to see it as a multi-dimensional interacting structure. That is what we talked about in economic development. So it's not just about growth. It's about the political parties that exist. How free are they to campaign? How free are they? How free is the process of the transfer of power? Now, you can have a situation where you have an economic system that is inclusive, that brings all people on board. People have an equal access to the economic good to some extent. We could also have a political system that is extractive, that gives only a certain group of people the right to have access to political power.
Yeah. Let me throw the third thing there, which is economic stability.
That your country is stable. Okay. You have no violence.
Okay. Just violence.
And that is why now the peace, economics piece comes in. So in a case like Liberia, you cannot do development like the way it is happening in other countries that haven't experienced a conflict, for instance. You can't. Because coming out of the conflict, we have what we call the conflict overhang. The country had a particular, an existing level of inequality. And after the war, inequality went up. A new dimension of inequality was added. And so you cannot do development there as development as normal. You have to do what is referred to as development plus. Because people coming out of the civil war have their own grievances. They have their own competing needs. They have a new dimension of what they want in this life. In the case of the guys who lay down their arms after the violence, they expected a life of opulence.
Yeah.
And so how do you address that? But then you have a question of the resource envelope, the size of our envelope. How do you use that envelope to spread the benefits of growth in an equitable manner? So you have to do what is called conflict-sensitive development, because now you want to move the country forward, but you're also going to move the country forward in a way that it is stable and not jeopardize the recovery process. Is it an easy ball game? Well, just look back at where we come from. Has it been easy over these years? No. That is why we are still graded as a fragile country, because those elements that gave rise to the conflict, those tensions, those sentimental wars of conflict are still in place.
Yeah. Dr. Johnson, some argue that this stability may have very minimal thing to do with economic growth and development, because take areas, trouble areas, as long as the people are economically savvy, economic activities are taking place, there can be growth. So peace or stability is not necessarily an ingredient. Take the Wild Wild West, for instance, that were making profits.
I don't understand what you mean by peace and stability itself is not an ingredient. Are you willing to go and invest in an area that you are told could go back to violence, or that you are told that, hey, excuse me, if you went there, if you have a disagreement with someone in terms of taxation or the sale of your goods and services, you are not assured of justice or a recovery through the court process? Are you willing to do that as an investor?
No, not necessarily, but the higher the risk, the higher the return, right? So investors,
yeah, people, and if you also know that there are those who we call conflict entrepreneurs,
okay,
who are willing there to go there and take the risk. And most time, because of the scarcity of investors coming to those places, those countries are willing to accept a discounted, especially countries like Liberia that are producing only primary commodities to the global chain. They would, given the situation, they will be willing to take a discounted rate for the natural resources. And we saw that during the Taylor years. Taylor was exporting iron ore, not iron. Taylor was exporting what? Diamond.
Yeah.
He was exporting log.
And rubber.
Yeah. And who are those? But if you look, was he giving it at the rate at which it should have been competitively in the international system during those 4 years? That was part of the underground economy. And so it was a lot of risk. People take those risks. But investors don't like risk.
Yeah.
They like stability. They like certainty. And that is when you grow the economy. When there is certainty, when everybody knows that tomorrow I can get up and go to work and earn an income. Tomorrow my children can go to school. Tomorrow, if I have a disagreement with my company, I can go to court. People feel assured, and they find an incentive now to engage in those productive ventures that they find personally profitable for their own lives. And so, to discount the value of peace and stability as you even begin to think about growth and then economic development, then I think that's a sad commentary. I don't see it that way.
Yeah, and that's fair. Let's look at Liberia's trajectory when it comes to economic development. How has it been?
The country has made steady progress, notwithstanding the challenges from the Ebola virus disease in 2014, and now this global horror we call COVID.
COVID.
Has it been where we all desire it to be? No, but I think we've made significant progress. We've made significant progress in the areas of politicking, in the areas of institutions building. There was growth, and then we had a relapse, largely because of Ebola. And before Ebola, we made significant advances in terms of the Millennium Development Goals at the time, now the Sustainable Development Goals. But Ebola caused us to go back. So we had a retrogression, and we lost those gains by some estimates by 50%. The new regime that is in power has taken note of that. And so if you look at the current development program, or the Pro Agenda for Prosperity and Development, they've aligned it, they've used it as a way to address those gaps that were experienced as a result of the last two development programs in Liberia. The first Lift Liberia Poverty Reduction Strategy, and then the second Agenda for Transformation. They are not only trying to address those gaps in the current development plan, but they also align it with the country's aspiration of being a middle-income country by 2023. And in so doing, they are talking now about improving the welfare of the people equitably by increasing access to healthcare, education, youth empowerment, and building social safety nets. So, and if you look at it, especially the question of youth empowerment is important. It's something we don't get to talk about a lot. But if you look at the structure of our population, if you look at our population pyramid, you got to find out that bulk of the population is between 16 and up to maybe 39 years. Yeah. And that is where you have a lot of the people. And so if you cannot go there and improve the welfare of the people within that particular segment of the population, what you are creating a condition that will lead to a vicious cycle. So I'm poor, I have no access to education, my own life expectancy is short, I'm going to have children because of my own welfare, I'm not going to be able to give those children better economic investment that will lead to better economic outcomes. And so those children are going to grow the same way, they too are going to have. So you have that vicious cycle of poverty, and which doesn't benefit the country. Because over time, what happens? If he's poor, he's not able to have access to basic food and nutrition. What do we say in Liberia? An hungry man.
It's an angry man, and empty bag cannot stand.
They become an easily accessible pool for violence. And you do not want that situation. You want to correct that gap.
So the topic for the day, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, Liberia's economic development challenges and imperatives for post-COVID growth and stability. So let's go, you talk about the trajectory. Let's go to some of those things that I needed that we call the imperatives.
If you look at what has happened to the economy at the moment, to the society, we've had this shock from COVID. Before that, we had a shock from Ebola. And the economy went downwards. And it was because of our own way of doing business with the rest of the world. I'm trying to be as soft here with the terminology as possible. Mm-hmm. We sell primary exports. iron ore, timber, and see what has happened as a result of COVID, for instance. The global supply chain went down, and it has affected the demand for those commodities on the global market. The guys who are making cars do not demand iron ore like the way it used to be because of the interruption in the chain. And so that has had consequences for our own income earning potential. And so then the question now is, how do we address it moving forward? My own approach to it is that, look, we have to think about developing Liberian entrepreneurship. If you look at the people that are doing the businesses down the water side, the macro entrepreneurs, one of the major challenge is access to capital.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we like to argue, they are not credit worthy. No. My own work in development finance and access to finance, a recent work I did was, what I found out was that it's not that they are not credit worthy. It's not that they do not want to repay the loans, but they do not have access to the loans, one. And when they do have access, some of those financial institutions, in their own estimation, are not trustworthy. And so if you look at it, that is why you find a movement of people from one financial institution to another. They are looking for institutions in which they have confidence. And the confidence, what's the outcome? The one institutions that they feel has the ability and the willingness to support their own drive.
Right.
And so that is one area we need to really focus. I know the Salif time there was what they call the Msme strategy, and there was one thing they emphasized: how do you ensure access of finance to the segment of the population? And the central bank at the time began a very good work. They established a financial inclusion unit, which I think this current administration has continued, ensuring that macro entrepreneurs, people who are not able to access the formal banking system, have access to capital at affordable rate. Yes, there has been growth in that particular sector, but then it becomes a question now of breadth. How widespread is it? There are people in other places who need those interventions, but are unable to access them easily. Some have to walk miles. And once they have to walk miles to provincial centers in the counties beyond Monrovia area, those walking become a form of taxation because it becomes an added burden. The transaction cost has increased. Yeah. The cost associated with their ability to access that transaction that has been provided. And we should also explain what is happening in downtown Monrovia.
And Dr. Johnson, before we get there, and that's why you talk about the access to capital. That's why the infrastructure come into play, right? The system on which these things can run. So in the absence of that, that's going to be a challenge. How do you address that?
You talking about infrastructure, or you talking about
and the system? Okay, let's say the person you are giving this loan to doesn't even have an address.
Okay, Dennis, I do not have an address, right?
Yeah.
But look at what has happened in the Southeastern Asian countries, and which is also happening in Liberia. Let me not go that far. You look at groups like Access Bank, for instance, or there's another microfinance group, BRAC, for example. They give loans to women, or not only women, because men too are also accessing their loans, who do not have the type of collateral that is required by the banking system. The question then is, what is the guarantee that these financial institutions are relying on to provide these type of loans?
Yeah.
There is something called the co-guarantor system, the co-insurance system. If you look at the way our people in the market operate, they've already had an informal structure that reduces loan default. The SUSU, as we call it.
Yeah.
In the literature, it's referred to as the Rotating Saving and Credit Association. There is also another one called the Yearly Club. So how can Dennis be a member of my SUSU, for example? First, we establish a group of people and we agree on a specific amount of money we want to put into a pot.
Yeah.
And we determine when each of us are going to benefit from the whole pot. So what we're doing there, we are pooling our resources to help each other to address a particular economic project. Once we made that determination, we are only agreeing that Dennis will be a part if Sam or someone who also has a proven record of credit worthiness can guarantee the ability of Dennis to repay. Now, it comes with consequences, because if Dennis defaults, one maybe I may not be asked to repay Dennis's default amount, but what happens is that in the next cycle, I wouldn't have access. I wouldn't be a part of that group. And if you look at the way we network,
yeah,
the information spread rapidly to other groups. And so what happens? Dennis is excluded from this financial opportunity. That's how the co-guarantor system works. And it is the same thing. I don't want to say similar, that those former institutions now that are doing this thing called microfinance are replicating. And then if you look at this whole thing of financial intermediation of microfinance, it is something that is embedded in our culture in West Africa. Look at the farmers. And they will select a huge swath of land for farming. And most times, how many persons does he have to do the work? Maybe it's him and his son. But where does he draw the extra pool of labor?
yeah,
By
cool.
going into what we call it what?
Cool.
Cool. That's a form of labor intermediation.
And Dr. Johnson, I asked someone, a financial guy, right here in the US, that why is it taking us so long to leverage those kind of or groups or those kind of ideas or those kind of structures for us to use that and replicate that in our formal sector? I don't normally see that happening in Liberia.
Well, it has to do with the country's history. And you cannot discuss Liberia's own economic trajectory without talking about the political history. For a long time, and in most developing countries for that matter, for a long time in Liberia, whom did we feel were capable of accessing those financial services? Those who are gainfully employed.
Yeah, or the elite.
Yeah. And so those who are at the lower rung of the economic ladder were not seen as viable. That was one end. On the other end, banks found it to be cost intensive. How do I measure trust? If I went to the woman down the waterfront market who sells maybe pepper, basic vegetables, how do I estimate her daily profit in order to come up with a table on how she can repay or determine her worth? But that and the structure that we use to develop our country, where we just look at these centers and we put them in place and expect that there was going to be a spread effect, also explain the problem. If you look at Liberia, where did you have banking centers those days? Banks were in concession areas. Topmanburg had a bank 35 miles outside of Monrovia until the mining company pulled out. So you see, the banks are moving where they found economic activities that provided a formal income. It wasn't catering to the people who are in the informal sector. And that is where we have a huge potential for growth. If you are able to provide those people the capital that they need, you'll be able to pull a significant people above the poverty line. Right? So that's the bank side. The next side is from the side of the consumers, from the side of those business people, those macro entrepreneurs. It's also a question of transaction cost. I have to leave my business at 8 o'clock in the morning to be at a banking hall. When I get to the bank, I have to stand in line. That will take me about 2 hours to reach the table. When I get to the head table, I have to fill out a huge volume of papers that will take me another period of time. Before I have to wait for the evaluator or the credit officer to determine the amount of money that can be given to me. Guess what? In the meantime, I'm foregoing an income that I could be earning by sitting at my business table. Let me speak the Liberian English now. And so, what is profitable for me? To stand there and bear that cost without even the certainty that I'm going to get a loan or to go back. And so you see, that is why these people have this much capital with this much need, because even when there is shock to their business, when they suffer severe losses, they are not able to immediately buffer that gap. So it's about mainstreaming these things as a part of our development that we can begin to think of addressing them. All right. And the central bank took some good decisions a couple of years back to so drive for financial inclusion, increasing access to finance. You started establishing rural financial institutions across the country, and they structured in a way that it became homegrown. That if you were from a particular county and they were looking for people to invest in it, I don't know what has happened to them now, but I think they are still functioning. That was one way to address it. But even at that, again, where is it? In the county capitals or the provincial towns of those counties. So those who are beyond those areas, there is also a cost burden for them. So it's about being able to embed those things in the main framework of our development and have a spread across the country. I mean, I'm saying it here like an academic, we're all optimists.
Right. And what is stopping that?
Forward thinking. We have to be forward thinking. We have to think outside the box. We have to look at our own context. Now, it's not a matter of looking at what the textbook tells you. What is the context in which you live? And that is one advantage the PRS process had in terms of conception. That development should be seen as a country-specific problem that can be addressed through a partnership between the government and its people and the country and the international system. It should not be seen as a one-size-fits-all problem. And so in that partnership, then you find a way using the voice of people to address those constraints toward the improvement of their well-being. So it's about thinking outside the box. It's about being context specific. It's context.
Yeah. I think you touched on the challenges a little bit more to Liberia's economic development in post-COVID Liberia, but talk to me more about those challenges and the prospects.
The skills?
No, the challenges for Liberia's economic development.
Another area too is we need to also look at our human resource capacity. We have a resource capacity challenge.
But Dr. Johnson, there are more universities and more graduates now than ever before.
What are the universities? What type of training are those universities providing? Are they providing a training that inspire innovation? Are they providing a type of training for the market as being demanded here? That's a fundamental question we need to address. If you look at our system, it was designed in a way that grew out of the West. Primarily at the time, it was there to supply labor force to the government at the time. And so everybody went to the university was aspiring to work where? In public service. I mean, it's a good thing. I applaud those who work in public service. There is nothing more honorable than serving one's country. Right? But the structure of our society now is such that the government cannot absorb everybody. So then it means we have to provide a skill set that, and even the skill set that is being required now in the current economy, in this current age, it's not entirely what higher education is providing. So that means we have to think the university become an agency of supply. You can only supply and have a demand on when there is a demand on the other side. So you must have that interaction.
Yeah.
If you cannot have that interaction, you're going to have either a policy failure or a market failure.
And why is this disconnect between what the university is supplying and what is needed in the market?
The global world has moved faster than us. Remember, we had a gap, a law. For 14 years, we were still sitting and waiting. The world wasn't waiting for us. See where ICT has advanced, for instance. I mean, look at a kid, a child that goes to school in this country at the age of 7. What is she playing on? The computer, right?
Yeah.
How many children at that age in Liberia even know what a computer keyboard looks like? I mean, just as an example, not to look down on the people there. I'm a boy from the slum, so I know it. But it's just to give you an example of how far behind we are. Is it something undoable? No.
Yeah, and that's where I was going. What can we do about this?
It means then we'll have to invest a lot in those areas. And like the current development plan talks about it. It's about improving access to education, early childhood education, for example, increasing the enrollment, reducing the student to teacher ratio. That means it's not only now about building schools. It's not only now about saying I'm going to pay the school fees of children. It's not only about paying this WAC fees for 12 and 9 and 6th graders.
Yeah.
It's about the quality of teachers we have in the classroom. The environment, how many students have access to libraries?
The
How
curriculum.
many schools in Liberia? My alma mater, it was only recently we were able to raise money to refurbish the library.
What's your alma mater?
The Great Topma High.
Okay.
Okay. And it's not that the students are not able to cope or cannot measure up with what may be demanded outside, but they do not have the resources that other students at a comparative level have. Textbooks, for instance, science laboratory. How many students even know what a simple test tube might look like beyond the Monrovia area?
Yeah.
If you went into rural areas, how many classrooms have people who are trained to be teachers? I applaud the volunteers who take up their time and say, look, you know what? It's about the future of our children. And I have some form of formal education. I'm not a trained teacher, but I'll go there in order to help these children make up their day. I applaud them for that. That is very selfless.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, where do the children go? I may not know what is updating now because I've been out of the country for a great while, but imagine those years. Some people used to leave their towns and go to another town, or maybe they have elementary school in their town. When they complete elementary school, in order to go to junior high school, what they had to do, they had to migrate to another town, right? And hoping that they can find a relative or some kind person who will be willing to accommodate them. And in some instances, if they completed the junior high school, what next they had to do? Move to another setting in order to access high school education.
Yeah.
And then when we complete high school, we all migrated where?
Monrovia.
Monrovia. That tells about inequality, Dennis. I don't know how I can explain inequality better than that to you now.
Okay, let me bring in our audience to make their comments. The first one is from Sam Wallow. Liberians have done far more harm to the development prospect of Liberia than any international organization, IMF, World Bank, etc. The damage has been and continues to be self-inflicted. I don't agree with Sam, do you?
For me, it's not a matter of disagreeing or agreeing, because I'm thinking, what is he talking about when he talks about self-infliction?
Yeah, I think that's when I was talking about, whether these world bodies have our best interest.
Well, we may argue that, like I said, is a chapter for another day, but it's also about you being able to get these world bodies to see what you need. I mean, there is a power imbalance here.
Right.
There is a power imbalance. You may not be able to talk about the approach in an equitable manner. But then the next question, and maybe this could be where Sam is going. How well do we use those resources that come from these international bodies? The PRSP, the PAPD talks about Liberia has been deprived of development because of human capital and the knowledge to transform our natural resources.
I don't know which study that came from.
Well, it's their own way of looking at the various development plans. That was one thing they did. All of the development plans until. But the question then is, and maybe I'm going to give a pass here to the believers of the growth without development thesis. It comes down to how well do we manage our own resources? On what do we invest the gains of those resources? I know the country is challenged. If you have an inefficient system, obviously wealth distribution becomes an issue. And inefficiency are things like corruption, for example.
Yeah.
If you have people who are administering this wealth without integrity, if you have a system where development is given only to the guy who supports my political party, if you have a situation where government's intervention is targeted at those areas from where it thinks it can accrue big votes, then we're not managing our resources equitably here. Like someone said in one paper I read, it's not that we are poor.
Yeah.
We are being managed poorly.
Yeah. Let me read this comment from Edward Admiral. He's our West African correspondent based in Freetown. Liberia, like many other African economies, is highly dependent on international trade. It exports commodities produced locally, mainly natural resources, and import goods for its own consumption. It lacks human resources, infrastructure, and fiscal capital. I think the road to sustainable economic development is a far-fetched idea, but yet there is still hope. Edward doesn't believe. Let me read a few more.
No, you can say that. You can say that. Edward talks about hope.
Yeah.
So, in as much as he may not be happy with what is obtaining, Edward is still hopeful that we can turn the corner.
Yeah, and hope is a good thing. Jackie Sayer, thanks, Sam. Growth without development would deepen inequality. The gap is now growing wider. Edward is also asking the difference between economic development and economic growth. I think you answered that question already. Let me bring in another comment from Jackie and you can respond. Economic growth is the house and economic development is the furniture in the house. If there is a stable and good growth, development is inevitable.
I mean, Jackie is right. Just think about it in terms of this cycle, right? The economy begins to grow, employment opportunities abound, people begin to get decent jobs, and they are earning decent income. Well, the next step to consume. Consumption becomes a form of investment. What do they invest in? Capital investment, children's education, healthcare, basic housing, not basic housing for that matter, decent housing. Who benefits from it? They buy food from the marketplace. They buy furniture for the house. So who benefits from that? The businesses on the other end who are selling those products or produce. And what do the businesses do? The businesses begin to expand. And once the expansion, what do? They increase their production and employ more people. And as more people are employed, what happens? More people begin to earn more income. And so what happens to the economy? The multiplier effect, the economy expands. So Jackie is right.
Let me see from CB Charleston Senior said Dennis wasn't born in the 70s and was a child in the 80s. He won't know what Liberia was in the 60s, 70s, and starting with deterioration starting in the 80s. I'm older than Sam, so I don't know what you're talking about. The Civil War occurred for reasons that go far beyond inequality. That is putting it very nicely. Inequality was but only one of the many contributing factors to the level of brutality put on display. Larry Kennedy, how do you argue the country is doing well with 3 years of negative growth? Banks are undercapitalized, civil servants aren't paid on time, population is growing with fewer jobs being created, worst economy in the region. Sam, right now we have, Dr. Johnson, we have liquidity problems and we have some financial or economic challenges. How do you square these things in the face of the economic development that we're talking about?
I was trying to, as much as possible, to avoid this monetary question.
I knew that, but do as much.
This is what I was saying. We have to look at the whole situation in totality, not only in piecemeal. I do not believe that it is entirely a monetary problem. I do not believe, by saying that, I do not believe that it's entirely a question of banking and banking relationship with the rest of the population. If you look at central bank data, people argue that a large volume of the money supply is outside of the banking sector. This is nothing new. As far back as 2016, if you look at central bank data, at some point in time, we had up to 97%. So at least 90% of the volume of money that was being provided to that economy was outside of the formal financial system. And several factors are responsible. One, you have And let's develop financial infrastructure, financial system.
Okay.
2, you have an economy where a lot of the people are in the informal sector. 3, you have a lot of the population that lives from hand to mouth. Income is just sufficient to provide consumption. There is little room for savings. And so that was why it was difficult at some point in time, and it's still difficult to use interest rate changes to influence monetary aggregates. I remember when Saliba was governor of the CBL at one point in time, and we still had the dual currency arranged by the time. There was a situation where you had a surplus.
Who was that? What's the name?
Eli Saliba. That was during the
Saliba.
years. And they introduced a monetary policy where they increased the interest rate on Liberian dollar and decreased, if I'm correct, and decreased the interest rate on US dollar. Theoretically, what that is supposed to do, if you increase the interest rate on Liberian dollar, it means Liberian dollar savings become attractive. And so there should be a movement of capital in that direction. People should go and save their money in the bank to take advantage of that new interest rate. US dollar is no longer an attractive asset to invest. And so we should pull back that money and diversify it into some other portfolio, some other business. But over time, the effect of that, and then in terms of price stabilization, we would have had surplus volume of US dollar on the Liberian market and fewer Liberian dollars on the market. And so the US dollar exchange rate should come down. But over time, the effect wasn't as large as was anticipated. Right. So it is because of that system. Now, coming back to the current situation, people argue that people have access to the banking system. Yes, that's true. A lot of people now have accounts in Liberia. And who are those lot of people? Government employees. Why did they establish those accounts willingly? No. They established it as a requirement for them to access their salaries from government. It was a strategy by government, and it's not only in Liberia, it's in other countries in Africa, to address the question of payroll padding, ghost names on the payroll. So for most of those people, their accounts are really what I call transition homes for their income. And so once the money hits the bank, and the bank sends them text, according to what I heard from Richard Cohn, who's a member of the House, people move to the banks to access their accounts. They're not going to invest those money into capital. Things like move it to savings account. They're going to take this money out to consume. And if what I hear from Richard Cohn, who's a member of the House, that what was happening during this whole crisis period was the bank will send you text, and when you get to the bank, the teller will tell you, sir, I'm sorry. Yes, we had to do it for the record, but there is no money in your account yet for that. That tells you there's a problem with the flow. There is a problem with the flow because most of those who were going there demanded money because money was an income and they needed the money for transaction purpose. That is one problem. So we've got to think about where is that problem coming from. If Kun is saying it is true, then there is a problem with the flow. The money is not moving from one end to another.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of banking confidence. 2, another thing we've got to look at, especially in the wake of COVID, is that in the build up to COVID, I think the central bank was estimating about 20% in default on loans.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when COVID came, those who had savings account ran to the bank out of panic and engaged in panic buying. We saw that here in the United States.
Yeah.
There was a time when we entered the stores. Could we find a Clorox?
No.
We couldn't. Everything was gone because we felt Armageddon was at hand. And so until the angel could come down, we should be ready. And we can consume that when he comes, he meets us healthy and we can give our own account of our lives. And so in the wake of that, what happened is then if people are taking their money out of precaution, and if people are not repaying their loans, would interest rate be an effective instrument? So it's not a question of banking confidence. I don't agree with that. I think it's something beyond that. And I could go one step further, even though I said I didn't want to talk about this. It's your fault, Dennis.
Yeah, sorry.
If you look at the global economy, we're in a state now that we call the liquidity trap.
Yeah.
You are here in the US, maybe for the people in Liberia, they don't know. But what has happened to interest rate? The interest rate, Fed has brought the interest rate to what? You say it, you know it, to one of the lowest, right?
Yeah.
And what should that mean is that funds for investment should be cheaper. Businesses should now have quick access to capital. But what has happened? The businesses are not taking advantage of that. Why? Because consumer confidence is still low. People are not buying as they used to buy. People are also holding their money and watching what they see. I was listening this morning to the news, and someone was saying that even the last stimulus check, some people didn't use those stimulus checks to engage in purchases, because that is the intent of the stimulus check.
Yeah.
And now you have the money coming and use this money to go and buy goods and services. Because if you buy goods and services, business now will have a reason to expand. And if they are to increase production, it means they will increase employment. And if they're able to increase employment, production increases, growth will increase. And so what I'm saying is that I do not agree entirely it's a monetary problem. It's also a fiscal problem. There is a need for the fiscal agency of government to complement this with appropriate fiscal interventions. I know they've started something in that direction with the stimulus that they started last year, but I think they also need to think about ways, again, about improving Liberian entrepreneurship to provide those soft loans, not entirely a grant, to businesses that could be suffering this particular shock.
Let's get this comment from Philip Norrington Jr. Look, let's be pragmatic about this issue. The impediments to growth and development in Liberia is an age-old problem of capital accumulation, and what can really drive this is the rule of law, where the justice system clamped down on misappropriation, embezzlement with vigor and rigor. In doing so, attraction of foreign direct investment, competitive free markets, subsidy to infant industry, focus on domestic production, indigenization of industry, privatization of government houses, and so on and so forth. I don't know if I understood all that, but you can break it down for me. Admiral K. Salif, a neglected area we ought to work on is policy planning as a cardinal tool of governance. Policy planning, determining policy objectives to which we can know when and why we must apply a specific policy, is the fuel of the economic governance engine. I like the mentions of political economy because the analysis helps us understand our structures, forces, institutions, policies, and laws that impede or promote economic development. I think you were touching on that. So go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what's I've forgotten the person's name. So
Ahmed.
I agree with him. The issue is it's not just an issue of planning, and I think he somehow captured that in his post. It's also an issue of monitoring and evaluation. It's also an issue of intersectoral coordination. One of the challenges that Madam Salif had at the end of PRS one, that is the Lift Liberia Poverty. You have poor coordination across government agencies and ministries. So much so that everybody was doing their own thing. And so the interventions were done in these things that are called sectoral cleavages.
Yeah.
I'm in my own corner, I'm trying to do what I can do. And so it wasn't, most of them were not even aligned with the overarching development goal. And the next thing is also how to do a monitoring evaluation. We should be able to sit and say, look, this is where we want to go. How do we measure these outcomes? How do we evaluate them? We cannot sit and leave that whole superstructure, because we can develop the monitoring plan. We can do the monitoring. If we do not do the evaluation, like Ahmed is saying, we wouldn't be able to measure how much progress we are making as a people.
Yeah.
But again, the challenge there too is, and it's a challenge for most developing countries that have done this PRS thing. Who determines what? I argue that the evaluation should start from the bottom. That if this thing is something that was developed based on participation, now there is a technical difference here between participation and consultation. Consultation, people come, you have your frame and say, look, this pretty big thing is what we are thinking about. Look at it and tell us what you think. Whereas participation is the other way around. You're working with the locals to identify the problem and map out strategies. And so if you take the planning process through that route, you should also give them a voice in the evaluation. So at the end of the period of implementation, you should come back to them and say, look, this is what we did. This is what we found out. What you think? Or what did you see in the implementation process? So it's a new way of thinking.
Hamilton Zilli say, with your understanding of development economy, what's the difference between human capital and human capacity, maybe, or human capability?
Human capability. This guy is a student of Amartya Sen.
Yeah.
Human capital is the resources, the quality of labor, so to speak. Capability is what can you do, given your own skill set.
And I don't know if you want to go here this way. You didn't want to go. What's your opinion on printing the new banknote? The way you diagnose the liquidity problem, I don't know if printing the new banknote is.
I should tell you that I'm not in support of printing new banknote. It will be just a short-term problem.
Yeah. Window dressing.
Yeah, it will be just a short-term problem to address what may seem to be a deficit in the flow, but it wouldn't address the fundamental question.
Ahmed is coming here with, one donor in Liberia told me recently that part of our problem is that Liberia doesn't really have a financial sector in the truest sense of the word, that we have no reserve system anchored on, say, the gold standard, nor do we have an interest rate system backed by an open market system that complements production of goods and services to diversify our economy. What do you say to such an outside observer, Professor Johnson?
Well, I wouldn't say that we do not have a financial sector. I would say that we have an underdeveloped financial sector. The central bank, we should know, is also new. I don't think the central bank has been in existence for more than 20 years. And so they've been taking time to develop the entire financial system. Now you have people talking about the sale of some monetary instruments to be able to attract capital. I know until during his tenure, Governor Mills Jones, they had where they used to go and do the foreign exchange auction for major importers. And so those were all stabilization measures. It may not function in the real way we know it here, like the open market committee that say the open market operations that do all of those things. But I think given where we are, I mean, I agree, I must say that there is more to be desired. But I think our capacity, and it's hard to do with our own capacity as a bank and as a country. I think we are just underdeveloped. I don't want to say it doesn't exist because, I mean, and I think where Ahmed is going is where I already touched on, whether interest rate can be effective in that particular economy as a stabilization tool for monetary aggregates. It wouldn't be entirely effective, especially given our own current crisis. I don't think interest rate will be the appropriate instrument outside of a fiscal action.
Let's read two more comments and then we're going to be drawing down the curtains. Manendo, what can be done in the short to medium term to integrate the informal sector into the formal economy?
Support Liberian entrepreneurship.
And what does that mean? Make Liberian people, give them money to open their own business?
It means what Liberians, businesses can have access to capital. And I'm not saying it should be free money.
Yeah. What is the benchmark in determining salary structure of our government officials?
I wish I could answer that question, but as you know very well, I'm not an official of government. I don't work for the finance ministry or the civil service agencies. So unfortunately, my dear brother, I cannot answer your question.
Yeah. And based on what you and Ahmed were saying back and forth, like it's more of a fiscal issue. Are you saying the issue we have in Liberia now from the liquidity issue is more of a finance ministry thing than a central bank thing?
It has to do with a complement of both. It has to do with a complement of both. It's not an either-or situation or an either-or situation. It has to do with a complement of both. Consumers will only be willing to increase consumption if they have confidence that the economy is stable and events are certain. Consumers will only be willing to move back their money to the banks if they are sure that they do not have to worry about the lingering effects of Corona. So it's both ways.
I lied. Let me read the last comment from Jackie. There are over 2,000 ghost teachers on the Ministry of Education payroll. The ministry is filled with loyalists who have no idea on how to educate our children. Oh, that's a comment. That was not a question. So, and Sam Waller is asking me when I talk about we put out the more graduates every year. Say, what's the quality of the graduate? Dr. Johnson, I think we should do this again.
I don't know.
But thank you so much for joining us tonight. Let's get your parting comments as we draw down the curtains tonight.
My parting comment is that I'm an internal optimist, and so I know the country has a challenge. We are not there. We still have a potential to. We're not reaching our potential yet, and several factors could be responsible. But I would think and I would trust that the present governors of the country would mean well for the country and begin to think outside the box in a forward-looking manner to address the challenges and help to move the country forward.
Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you coming and throwing light to this new branch of economics, that's development economics. And I hope we do this again, but thank you so much for your time. We want to thank all our viewers and those who will watch later. This is Focus on Liberia, where we strive to educate, to elevate, and promote all things Liberian. Our guest has been Dr. Samuel Y. Johnson. He's a professor at the Delaware State University, and he is a development economist. We want to thank all of you for watching. Keep it here at Focus on Liberia. Every time we end our broadcast, we don't end without playing our closing song, which says, "We are all Liberians." So whether you believe this printing the new banknote is going to solve the problem or not, we are still all Liberians. Whatever your political ideology may be, we are still Liberians. And it is incumbent upon all of us to do whatever it takes to make our country the greatest of all and the glorious land of liberty by God's command. On behalf of all of us here at Focus on Liberia, my name is Dennis Jai saying good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home. Liberian people. Liberia.